Hey, happy Tuesday morning to you, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. We are involved in some linguistic studies in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in Paul's discussion of the resurrection. Look, I was raised believing that when Paul says, when the mortal shall put on immortality, that Paul is talking about this biological substance. It's mortal. It's subject to physical decay or physical death. Therefore, when I am resurrected at the so-called end of time, that must mean that I will put on a, quote, physically immortal body. Well, much to my surprise, when I really began to dig into the linguistics of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I discovered that Paul uses some words that simply do not bear that meaning, and I was shocked, needless to say. Paul says, for when the mortal shall put on immortality. Well, what is that word mortal? As I shared with you in the last video, it is from the Greek word phthora. And phthora, so far as I've been able to determine, I certainly may have missed something, but so far as I've been able to determine, pardon me, phthora is never used of biological substance. It's never used of the biological makeup of a human being. In the New Testament writers, Paul uses it, Peter uses it to speak of man living in a realm opposed to God. Peter even goes on record as saying that some apostates of his time had escaped the pollution that is in the world through lust. The pollution, that's phthora, and they had escaped that by becoming children of God, but now they're returning to that. Well, folks, they had not escaped the physical body, but in 1 Peter chapter 1, 2 Peter chapter 1, I'll get it right in a minute, 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter writes to the faithful, and he says that through the knowledge of Christ, his audience had escaped the corruption that was in the world and had become partakers of the divine nature. So here is corruption living in the world, in a world opposed to God, and then being transformed into the image of God. Well, guess what? Paul uses that same imagery when he uses the word aphathora, a form of that, in 1 Corinthians 15, when he says, the mortal shall put on immortality. In Ephesians chapter 4, and boy, Ephesians chapter 4 and 5 is a very powerful context. Paul says he urged his Gentile audience, put off the old man. See, this is just like Peter talked about in 2 Peter chapter 1. Put off the old man which is corrupt, phthora, and put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and holiness. So here, just like Peter, talking about escaping the corruption that is in the world through lust, here is Paul, talks about putting off the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitful lust, putting on the new man. Just like Peter talks about being transformed into the image of God through the knowledge of Christ. Now, this word, phthora and aphathora, you know, there are passages in which we might say, well, okay, that refers to the ability to perish. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 16 and 17, Paul says, do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? And if any man defiles, that's from our word, phthora, and obviously it's a verbal form. If any man defiles the temple of God, him God will destroy. Same identical word. It's in the second person, masculine, active. And so here we find a context, but the very first word, if any man defiles the temple, is the proper translation, as many translations point out. But God would destroy that man. using the same identical word. Now, some have argued that it ought to be translated defile in both ways. But again, the point of it is, yes, indeed, some words have variations of meaning, different nuances of meaning. And 1 Corinthians 3:17 is a good example of that. And Romans chapter 1:23, in which man changed the glory of the invisible God into the likeness of an image of corruptible man and of animals and of beasts. So there you have a slightly different context, which, by the way, is not resurrection. But notice this. Back to Ephesians chapter 4. When Paul urges his audience to put off the old man, which is corrupt according to deceitful lust, he calls them to awake from unrighteousness. That means the corruption that he's talking about is unrighteousness. And that term awake in Ephesians 4 and Ephesians chapter 5, awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ will give you life. That is a direct echo of Daniel chapter 12. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise, to some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. So here Paul is using these terms, corruption, incorruption, in the context of unrighteousness versus righteousness, and into the direct discussion or direct context of resurrection. Just like he uses phathora and aphathora in 1 Corinthians 15. We have phathora, a word that never refers to biological substance. We have aphathora, that granted may, in a couple of isolated passages, carry that kind of a connotation, but when used with a word that does not refer to biological substance, and when we consider other passages in which Paul does discuss resurrection, that virtually forces us to see that Paul is not using aphathora to refer to biological immortality at all. He is using the word phathora, immortality, in the sense that he's used it consistently, in the sense that Peter has used it consistently. Never to refer to biological substance. And then he turns right around and gives the antonym of it, the opposite of it, and that virtually forces us to see that Paul's discussion, when he talks about the mortal, man living opposed to God, man alienated from God, man would then be brought into the life and in the sphere of God. It is a contrast, therefore, between unrighteousness and righteousness. That's what Paul's focused on in Ephesians 4. That's what Peter's focused on in 2 Peter. Boy, this is powerful, powerful evidence once we will accept it. Well, if you want more on these linguistic studies, get a copy of Daniel Rogers' excellent little book, The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ. He has really good examination of these linguistics in this book. You will love it. Go to my website, BibleProphecy.com, order the book, send me a note saying, Don, I saw your offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I will refund everything except $8. Your total cost will be $8. Regularly it'll be $10. All right, saving you a couple of bucks on this really excellent little book. Well, we've got more linguistic studies on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, so we will see you on the flip side.